Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. So thank you all for tuning in to the final of Plants Beyond Empire, which is a mini-series of discussions that have been organised as part of the Formations Programme. So the Formations Programme is led by the Postcolonial and Global Studies Research Group in collaboration with Bonington Gallery. The series foregrounds the work of underrepresented writers, academics, artists, intellectuals, and activists worldwide who address inequalities of all kinds, often bringing people from different places and working practices together for important conversations. So my name's Sophie Fuggle. I currently teach on the Museum and Heritage Programme at Nottingham Trent, and I'm delighted to be involved in the Plants Beyond Empire series, which looks at different artist, creative, intellectual and community initiatives around plants within and beyond histories of empire, colonialism, agriculture and extraction. So this, as I said, is the third and final episode in the series. If you missed the previous ones, these are available on the Bonington YouTube site. We kicked off a few weeks ago with artist Rebecca Beinart and her collaborators talking about their exploration of the Nottingham Island site, and we got an advanced preview of their work in progress film. Last week, colleagues at NTU and Birmingham Botanical Gardens shared the work they've been doing to diversify storytelling within the gardens. And this week, I'm really excited to be in conversation with a long-standing collaborator and friend, Claire Reddleman. So Claire and I worked together back in 2018 on a project looking at the legacies of France's overseas penal colonies. Since then, our work has gone in kind of different directions, yet seems to have come back together via a shared interest in plants, colonial archives, and the Anthropocene, and thinking about creative ways of how to explore these connections. So just to introduce Claire a little bit more, Claire Reddleman is a lecturer in digital humanities at the University of Manchester, and she works on digital cultural heritage, visual methods, mapping, and contemporary art. And she is author of Cartographic Abstraction in Contemporary Art, which I think came out with Routledge in, I'm going to say 2017 or 2018, sometime around then. She's also a photographic artist, and you can see her work at www.clairereddleman.com. And hopefully there's going to be a link to that in the chat at some point. So tonight we want to juxtapose two very different flora, the ginkgo and the castor bean plant. So both of these, we feel, offer different ways of mapping and understanding human plant entanglements, as well as thinking about how these entanglements shift during European colonialism. So the way we're going to do it is Claire will open by talking a bit about an artistic project she's done called Ginkgos of the British Isles. And then I'll talk a little bit about the castor bean plant as arguably an overlooked plant whose multiple uses also position it as a key vector or a key marker within what Anna Singh and Donna Howray call the plantation scene. So I hope to draw on some of the castor bean's multiple uses, past and present, as a way of thinking about enduring impacts of colonialism and the specific ways the plant evokes metaphors of toxicity, invasion, flow, and salvation, linked with various ideas about coloniality and I guess post-coloniality. So we expect the conversation to last about an hour total. At any point during our kind of respective talks and then the discussion afterwards, please send us any questions, points, clarifications, and you can do this either by typing them into the chat on screen at YouTube, but I think you might need a subscription for that. So if you're not subscribed and logged in, it might be better to send a question by email to the following address, formations@ntu.ac.uk. So that's formations@ntu.ac.uk, and we'll be able to pick those up and kind of integrate them into the discussion. So right, enough of me, now to hand over to Claire. So I've been really looking forward to hearing all the details about your Ginkgos project, Claire. And I've obviously followed it a bit on Instagram and looking to hear a bit more about the kind of backstory.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sophie. And really pleased to be joining everybody on YouTube this evening to talk about this, what I think is a very interesting project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an sort of visual artistic research project that I carried out in 2019. And it's called Ginkgos of the British Isles. You can see that if you wish to follow along online on my website. clairereddleman.com, and there's a big photo of ginkgo leaves there to lead you in the right direction. And there's lots of images there as well. But we're going to look at a series of digital collages that I made, which was kind of the focal point of this project. So as I'm speaking, you can have a look at those on the screen. So if we go to the first image, I will mention a little bit about what this is, a little bit of historical background, and a little bit about what got me interested in doing a research project about ginkgos in the first place. So it's called full title, #Ginkgos of the British Isles. And it was an academic research project that I did while I was working at King's College London in the Department of Digital Humanities. And at the time I was teaching students a fair bit about topics to do with social media, global media, and started to think, well, can I do a project that will kind of speak to some of these interests? People were starting to take more seriously the idea of doing research about and with Instagram at the time, using different social media platforms to kind of be a way of doing research and to kind of use their affordances, their possibilities, kind of ways that they foster communication, to sort of, that was kind of entering more seriously into the sort of research landscape, if you like, at the time. And I was very interested in sort of thinking, well, could I use that in some interesting way? So I decided that these ideas came together as an idea to do a project asking Instagram users to share photos of specimens of the very popular tree, Gingko Biloba, that they had spotted anywhere in the British Isles. So it was kind of participatory in that I was asking people to share images from their everyday life, but to do it in this way that was very kind of native to Instagram, to the way that you share images and tag them. So I sort of put out this call for participation, basically. And I said I would then take people's photos that they wanted to submit to the project, and I would pair them with selected map images that I went off and chose myself that related to Gingko Biloba's journey to the British Isles. So Gingko Biloba is native to China, and its journey to these islands, very far away, took place via Japan and Korea, and then via the Netherlands, before Gingko Biloba arrived in the East End of London, as I understand it, in 1750. So it had this very interesting arrival story, and I was sort of thinking at the time about ideas of how we think about, I suppose, how long, the particular idea I was thinking about at the time was, how long does it take before we sort of start to see a person or a group of people, or perhaps a tree species, as belonging in a particular place? I was thinking a lot about working with international students, and I was also thinking about the ways that we talk about immigration in public life in this country. As an island nation, these are sort of ways, I guess, that we think about how people and other material, if we are material beings, of course, how we arrive, in a sense. And there was always this interesting element, I think, of the way that we talk about trees, in the sense of them being these often very long-lived beings that have this kind of longer lifespan, this longer overview, in a sense. And the ginkgo kind of started to come to my attention when I was looking for plants, sort of tree species to think about as part of this project, that have been introduced to these islands, but that are also kind of interestingly celebrated. So the ginkgo is an arrived, introduced species, but especially as I was starting to sort of poke around on Instagram, I was noticing lots and lots of photographs of ginkgos that were very celebratory. There's this real spirit of kind of positivity, celebration, kind of reverence, admiration, So in some ways I was sort of thinking this is a really positive way of, that this is the positive side of Instagram, where we sort of celebrate things that we want to share with other people and kind of the best aspects of life. There is the other sort of, more toxic side of Instagram that generates lots of anxiety and other associated problems. But I was kind of interested in this way that people were using it in this sort of quite celebratory way. And I thought, could I do something interesting with that? And then the other thing that happened was I was on a trip to Scotland, and I noticed in North Queensferry near Edinburgh, I saw a ginkgo tree growing in someone's garden. And I thought, hold on, I sort of started noticing ginkgos by this point, I think, and I spotted it and I thought, so the ginkgo grows this far north. I hadn't really noticed, I hadn't thought about its geographical extent prior to that. And I started thinking, well, if I notice them in London quite frequently, I wonder what their actual distribution around this island might be. And so Instagram sort of started to appear as a way that you might be able to crowdsource some knowledge and information about that distribution. So I was quite interested in how it could be a sort of way of enabling people to participate, sort of, and to try to create a kind of co-produced view of how this particular introduced species is experienced by people in their kind of everyday life, their visual life in the British Isles. So all of the images that people contributed to me, which was not in the end a huge number, which made it much more manageable in practice. We could perhaps look at the next image as well. It wasn't an unmanageable number, but this is obviously not something that is able to create a kind of representative depiction of the life of this tree species in these islands. So I sort of had a kind of an interest in that, but that was not a goal that was actually kind of met in this project. But I think it went in an interesting direction nonetheless. So each of the images that I was sent, I paired with a map that references one of the places that I understood to be part of Gingko Biloba's journey to arriving in Britain. So that included maps of Japan, where the tree was initially encountered sort of in the first encounter by Europeans was by the German surgeon and traveller and explorer Engelbert Kempfer, and he arrived there in 1692, and he was working for the Dutch East India Company. So he was working as a physician on board ship, and he had been travelling around through Iran, Persia at the time, parts of the Middle East, and he visited Siam, as was on the way to arrive in Japan at this posting to the VOC, is the acronym for the Dutch name of the Dutch East India Company. They had a trading post in Nagasaki. And so he had done quite a bit of traveling and quite a bit of drawing and documenting in quite an expansive way, the people and scenes that he was encountering, but he also took a particular interest in plants. So he, in fact, collected a specimen of Gingko biloba seeds that he encountered during his time working for the VOC in Nagasaki. And he preserved and transported Gingko biloba seeds as part of his kind of endeavours in Japan. He also, for people who are particularly interested in kind of the history of botanical publishing and sort of knowledge dissemination, the book that he published about his studies on local plants in Japan was called Flora Japonica, and it's part of his larger publication called Aminatatum exoticarum, which can be seen if you visit the Royal Collection Trust, hold a copy of this book, and there is a very interesting piece that I came across published by the Linnaean Society, who have been working on conserving the copy of this book by Kempfer that was actually owned by Carl Linnaeus. So Linnaeus is most important in the history of botanical knowledge development for developing the system of binomial naming. So 2 names in Latin given to plant species. And he was sort of a first force in kind of trying to taxonomize, to kind of create an ordered catalogue of the whole, that could extend potentially to the whole of the plant world. So there was quite an interesting kind of entanglement there between Kempfer and Linnaeus, who later owned a copy of Kempfer's book, Flora Japonica. And so I was quite interested in this moment where it was actually as part of a trading company that Kempfer was actually in this position to obtain the Gingko Biloba in the first place, and then for it to be transported. Now, there is some, I've done a little bit more reading, but I'm not a scientist, I'm not a biologist, or a horticulturist even, unfortunately, but I've been expanding my reading, and there is some thought that the ginkgo could have arrived in Europe and then subsequently traveled to North America via groups of the sort of specimens of the tree that arrived in Korea, perhaps instead of Japan. But either way, the route of kind of introduction wasn't directly from China into Europe. It was either via Japan or via Korea. But so some of it, it's a little bit hard sometimes to pin down these precise introduction stories. So there's an element of story and an element of history as well. And the seeds then were transported to the Netherlands, and they arrived there are some in Utrecht and some in Leiden, and there's a university botanical garden in I think in both locations. And so some of those, I wanted to show some of those locations as part of this kind of long kind of drawn out journey of the Gingko Biloba towards Europe, and then ultimately, but from my point of view in this project, into Britain. So some of the maps show locations in the Netherlands as well. And my understanding is that then the first specimen of Gingko biloba arrived in London in 1750, and it was raised in a nursery that was in Mile End, which is now part of East London. And it's not part of central London, but it's also not part of outer London. London has grown so much during this time that it's been completely encompassed by the city. But at that stage, which I found really interesting, it was separated from the mass of the city by open fields. So it was a village. And apparently the seeds ended up arriving to this nursery. And I became really interested in this because that was very near where I lived at the time. And I started noticing Gingko bilobas kind of all over London as I was cycling around. And I thought one of the things that's particularly interesting, or a sort of unintended side effect perhaps of when you sort of embark on a new research project, can be that you sort of start to reorganize your own attention and start noticing these things all the time. And it became a real habit for me. So I would sort of stop off at trees and collect leaves and collect seeds and so on. Anyway, so there was a sort of interesting thing in terms of methods. It was a new method for me to use Instagram to do this. And I quite liked the way that it sort of made it fairly public, and it was quite shared in a way. I was publishing the images, the collages, on Instagram as soon as I was making them. So we could cycle through a few more of those as I'm mentioning that now. And there's a sort of nice sense, I think, of sharing that rather than having to wait for the really long kind of timescales that tend to be operative in academic publishing. You could just sort of quite readily say, you know, this is part of my research project, and share this thing and share it with the people who had submitted the photos to me. So it kind of felt like a way of, I suppose, sort of giving something back to the people who had submitted some material to me. And there's a kind of nice element to that. But then there is also, of course, an aspect of like just things that we do on social media sort of pass by in such an ephemeral way, that actually the place where I've sort of ended up wanting to archive them is in a website that's more stable than that. So they don't just sort of fly past in this flurry of images. And so it was an interesting new method for me. And another practical thing that I wanted to mention about the project that I thought it would be worthwhile to do, or sort of use the research project as an opportunity to do, was to go and visit the national collection of Gingko Bilobas and cultivars, which is housed at Evesham in Worcestershire. And you can view the website for the national collection at npcginkgo.org. So this is a national collection of this particular species of plant, and it's run by a horticulturist called Tony Davies. And I kind of thought this was an interesting view into a world that I sort of had access to at the time, because I used to work at the Royal Horticultural Society, and I was kind of aware of the existence of national collections of different plant species. But then it sort of occurred to me a bit later that I thought, actually, I don't think most people probably know about this kind of thing. And because it's sort of a combination of professional work, but also kind of the passion of the amateur, the collector, the person sort of driven by love and sort of enthusiasm for the particular plant species that they end up getting interested in. It's sort of in this interesting in-between zone, which I think is a little bit connected to the history of the sort of colonial history of plant introductions in some sense, which, you know, it's sort of unfashionable these days, I suppose, to talk about talk about them in a positive light, but there is a sort of this positive aspect of introducing kind of plant diversity into new physical geographical locations. So national collections aren't really doing that, but they are kind of preserving and extending the kind of presence of a particular species in this particular place. This is something that happens in the UK. And the National Collection has grown in the time since I visited it, and it now currently consists of over 300 cultivars of Gingko Biloba. And I think there's something kind of quite beautiful about this, the sort of I don't know, the intimacy of a collection like that. In a sense, it's in a sort of domestic home setting, so lots of young plants live together in kind of close quarters, and they currently live in what are called air pots, so that they have the ability to develop healthy root systems, hopefully in anticipation of being able to be planted out in the ground in the future. But this is sort of somewhere between the formal sort of commercial enterprise and a sort of hobbyist enthusiast interest. So it's not something that's hugely resourced. And I wanted to show the way that this one aspect, I suppose, of how the Gingko biloba kind of has its existence in another way in these islands. So just two other things to mention, because I don't want to take up too much time. I did think about naming this project, and I spent a bit of time sort of thinking about how does it make sense to talk about this country, in a sense. We are a sort of group of islands with a convoluted history. And at the moment at which Gingko Biloba kind of arrived and became part of the cultural and physical life of this island ecosystem, the political configuration was different to what it is now. So at the time it entered this island, the island was part of a political formation that was, sorry, I've lost my place. It was known as the Kingdom of Great Britain. And at that time that incorporated the then Kingdom of Scotland and the Kingdom of England, which included Wales. But obviously a lot has changed since 1750. And I didn't want to go for Great Britain because that name doesn't include Northern Ireland. And because Northern Ireland is part of the UK, I was curious about the presence of Gingko Biloba there and potentially in the whole island of Ireland. But this project was, kind of done in a very remote online way, so it didn't involve kind of doing touring around to make my own observations, unfortunately. And I wasn't sure about ginkgos of the United Kingdom because it kind of needed to work in an online setting. So I opted for British Isles because I didn't think British Archipelago was the most approachable name to work online and to be accessible for people. But it is a reasonably good way of just describing a group of islands, which is what this geographical entity is. So I settled on British Isles as the most kind of approachable handle for this. And then I would really like to know more about kind of what is actually the farthest extent of Gingko bilobas. Have they been planted on perhaps some of the smaller islands of the British Isles? That's not something I know about yet, but perhaps other people do know about that and would like to let us know. I thought a crowdsourcing method could potentially be sort of extrapolated more widely from this project, but I think you would really have to do quite a lot of just contacting people directly and sort of seeking that information rather than doing a sort of more passive kind of call out on Instagram. And the last thing I wanted to mention before I draw to a close and we can hear about Sophie's research on the castor bean is that we were sort of talking about this question of time and time scales and kind of cycles of capitalist time when we were kind of starting to talk about this project. And I think one of the really interesting kind of afterlives, in a sense, of this colonial introduction story is the way that ginkgo seeds are now being shared internationally again, but for a very different reason. So there are a few famous ginkgo trees that live at Hiroshima in Japan, and they were living in Hiroshima at the time that the nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima by the Americans, precipitating the end of the Second World War in the Pacific. And these trees, I believe that there are 6 of them, they survived the atomic blast. There are other trees that also survived, so they're not the only ones, but they are, I think, justly very celebrated for this reason. And there's a wonderful story that I was reading about one of them, which is located at a Buddhist temple in the Myojo-in temple in the Higashi ward of Hiroshima. And they have one of these famous radiated ginkgo trees. It's estimated to be over 150 years old. So it had quite a substantial life already before this kind of disruptive, sort of catastrophic life event, in a sense, in its own lifespan. And it still continues to live. This is one of the things that I thought was very interesting about ginkgos in terms of like when we were thinking about time and kind of lifespans. One of the things that people find really compelling about Gingko biloba as a species is its connection to the kind of deep time of our planet, if you like. So there's a wonderful book by Peter Crane, which is a kind of biography of the Gingko biloba, and he talks there about the one of the most sort of popular epithets that's connected with the Gingko biloba is the idea that it's a living fossil, and this is because it's the last in its genus, and it existed in the sort of deep time of the Jurassic past of the planet. So it sort of, you know, pre-existed all of the kind of rise of the whole contemporary world, modernity writ large, technologies, human civilization, the human species. And so people do find this sort of quite a compelling factoid, I suppose, to relate about the species. But Peter Crane talks about this kind of idea of it having this incredibly long overview, and then we sort of sense this idea that almost like as a species the ginkgo has somehow kind of seen all of this. And I sort of think it's quite an interesting way that we make a connection between the individual and the kind of wider species or the collective, the whole, even if one individual ginkgo tree might just be you know, it might be relatively young, or, you know, it's obviously only lived in one place. We sort of have this notion of like the species having this kind of distribution and being a sort of collective entity in a sense. So there's something very, very sort of compelling about these survivor trees, as they're called, at Hiroshima. And there's currently a project that is being undertaken by an organization called Mayors for Peace, where they are sending seeds to various botanical gardens in different cities. And they've arrived in various cities in Britain. So one of them is currently being cultivated, or a few of them are currently being cultivated in the Glasgow Botanical Garden, and a few of them have gone to Oxford as well. And then they will, in future years, the aim is to plant them out in public parks so that they can stand as a kind of memorial, and a message of peace. So I think there's sort of quite a compelling, moving way in which the living sort of specimens of the species are being disseminated and being kind of reintroduced in a sense into the British Isles, but for this kind of particular purpose of spreading a message of peace for the future. So we can pick up on some of these different avenues of thought, I'm sure, as we discuss things in a bit, but I would now like to pass you over to Sophie for her talk about the castor bean.
Okay, thank you, Claire. So lots to think about. I've got lots of notes to pick up on sort of in a bit. So I guess obviously Claire finished up by talking about these kind of different time frames and the kind of longevity of the ginkgo, but also that kind of how it sort of fits in with human time. And I guess the idea with, obviously people talk a lot about the nuclear blast and the kind of stop clocks and time stopping at that moment. Also kind of an interesting image, but yet you've got this tree that continues to move on in its own time. So I'm going to change the kind of the speed of things a little bit in what I'm going to say about the castor bean. So the ecological and cultural legacies of colonial botany and agriculture have been subject of a lot of different kind of extensive research. There's been significant focus on the transnational impact of things like sugar, cotton, and rubber plantations, and I'll mention rubber again in a bit. Obviously, there's been work done around the toxicity of indigo processing, and also, I think particularly at the moment, there's a lot of studies being undertaken around the kind of often violent contemporary geopolitics of palm oil production. Yet, despite extensive cultivation within colonial contexts and multiple applications, kind of hundreds of applications, Ricinus communis, the castor bean plant, has been overlooked as a plant which arguably has shaped the world as we know it. So I want to start off with showing, I guess, the first image, which is from the British Museum collection. This is an image that's taken from an album entitled Merion's Drawings of Suriname Insects, etc., by Maria Sibylla Merion from around 1701, between 1701 and 1705. And I think what's interesting about this is that already in the very early 18th century, there's already the presence of castor bean plants in South America, despite them being kind of at the time originating from Africa. So there's this kind of transnational presence of the castor bean in the early 18th century. So the image, I think it's a really nice image. It emphasizes different colors of the plant. But if I move on to my next image, which is a close-up photo of a castor bean plant that I took in France last summer, you can see that there's actually quite a difference here, and the spiky fruits are often kind of very bright pink, but kind of range from a kind of more browny hue to reds, pink, orange, and so on. I think things get even more interesting if you look at the castor bean seeds themselves. So actually they're seeds, not beans. And if we go to image 3, and what you can see here is that this is an image from the Kew Gardens site. You can see they've got really striking stripes, a bit like tiger stripes. And like a tiger, no two sets of stripes are the same. So all seeds are unique, like snowflakes as well. So showing you that kind of set of images, which is a really kind of intense set of kind of colors and markings, I want to contrast these with some other images, I'll show you in a bit, that for me might be considered within a wider iconography of what we might call the plantationer scene. So in proposing the concept of the plantationer scene as one of many possible ways to understand planet-wide impact of industrial capitalism and colonialism, Don Haraway describes how wide-scale agriculture and cultivation projects of empire differed significantly from earlier forms of seed dispersal due to, and I quote, factors of scale, rate, speed, synchronicity, and complexity. And it's this idea of speed that I want to take up in thinking about, specifically thinking about the castor bean plant. So while the castor bean plant's thought to have originated in Africa, today it can be found all over the world and is frequently cited as an invasive species due to the ease with which it thrives, but also because of the extreme toxicity of its seeds, which can pose problems for livestock. And I'll come back a little bit to toxicity, this question of toxicity later on. So the term plantationer seed puts a specific form of activity, the plantation, at the center of the current geologic epoch, in the same way that the term Anthropocene locates the human as single dominant driving force. Yet we should be wary of thinking of either the plantation or the human in the singular. So Catherine Yusof and others have argued that to emphasize the Anthropocene as singular collective experience fails to acknowledge the extreme sustained violence of colonial dispossession and displacement of enslaved and colonized bodies, of which there are multiple complex iterations. Anna Singh talks about the patchy Anthropocene as a useful way to understand the lived experience as always, and I quote, parochial, perspectival, and performative. And I find this also really helpful thinking about the castor bean. So if we think of plantations, these are not ubiquitous. The world is not a plantation, but the impact of plantation ecologies, taken up as they are with the proliferation of the same, are implicated in global anthropogenic climate change. So in contrast to the vibrant colours we just saw of the castor bean plant and its seeds, I want to show you now a quite different image. So can we have image 4, please? Yep. And so this is photographer Stefan Passett's photograph of a castor bean plantation on the outskirts of Beijing in the early 20th century. This was taken as part of the Archives de la Planète series, which was funded by Albert Kahn, and has been subject to lots of kind of studies around the idea of the visual colonial archive par excellence. if you look at Passet's image, it suggests a kind of quite easily forgotten landscape. It's not particularly interesting. The photo is devoid of humans, despite the fact that there's a path which suggests, kind of humans passing by. The plantation is not particularly impressive in terms of scale or organization. And the washed out murky green hue makes the plants, which, as we've seen, are really quite kind of striking in their colourful, with the colourful fruits, makes this kind of quite difficult to identify as being castor bean plantation. So I think this is quite interesting, especially given that the Archives of the Planet set of images were, using the glass plate photography method, were notable for using colour at a very early point. So this is in the very early 20th century. So actually, they're kind of known for being very rich in colour, yet what we have here is something that is kind of lacking in colour. And you've got this kind of murky green. And green, of course, is the sort of generic descriptor for nature and all that kind of gets included. And it's a way of kind of homogenizing different landscapes. So if you look at something from a kind of aerial view of castor bean plantations today, you're just going to kind of probably see that kind of generic murky green rather than the kind of specific color detail. And so from, when you extrapolate or when you take that distance, you end up kind of not seeing the different human, non-human interactions that are taking place. So Vin Nardizzi has identified the role of the colour green in enforcing a certain image of nature stemming from, and I quote, a genetic fantasy dreamed by white privilege. So in other words, the term green, particularly when used alongside ideas of ecology or environment, describes a human conception, which is really nothing more than a frame for human, and more precisely colonial and white colonial activity and interaction above all else. So indeed, when viewed at a distance, as you can see, the castor bean plant also works to confirm this global image of green that we see in Passet's photo. Yet, as we have seen from the other images, its brightly coloured spiky fruits can range from many different colours, and the stripy brown seeds are incredibly visually powerful. So by looking sort of closer at the specificity of the plant, it's a kind of way to invite us to think a bit more about different human encounters that occur through its cultivation, transformation, and its transformation from what we might think of the transformation from plant to plantation, which kind of is the way that we think about the plantation as scene. So thinking about human encounters, interactions with the castor bean plant, the castor bean seed has many different therapeutic and toxic uses, and these appear to have been known for thousands of years. So archaeological findings in the Border Cave in South Africa suggest the seed was used as a poison around 24,000 years ago. It was used as a laxative for a variety of ailments in Egypt in 1500 BCE, and is mentioned by Hippocrates for similar purposes in 400 BCE. Ancient Chinese medicine employed castor oil externally for a range of conditions, which also included rheumatism, respiratory illnesses, and skin conditions such as boils and burns. So it's got a very kind of long history of use by human beings. However, within European colonialism, the role of castor oil becomes closely linked to obsessions with flow and fluidity. So castor oil's well-known role as a laxative makes regular appearances in post-colonial literature by references to colonial officials and their scatological obsessions with bowel movements. Can we have image 5 now? Cool. Elsewhere, the use of castor oil as punishment for colonial subjects evokes paternalistic images of colonized people and enslaved people as recalcitrant children in need of medicine. So basically medicine for their own good. Things taken even more sinister turn in Mussolini's Italy, where castor oil is force-fed to communist prisoners, many of whom ended up dying of dehydration as a result of this enforced diarrhea. So that's one kind of set of flows and fluidity that castor oil becomes co-opted to. However, it's more as an accessory to fossil fuel that its significance really takes off from the late 19th century onwards. It's in the new industrial uses developed that the castor bean offers an intriguing example of what Anna Singh has described as Apache and Top scene. So on the one hand, the extractor engine lubricant in both aircraft and automobiles makes a key vector of speed and fluidity, which defines both the 20th century military industrial complex, but also this quest for ever faster, ever smoother movement across time and space that defines global capitalism. On the other hand, the extensive cultivation of the castor bean plant across the empire and empires, and the co-option of different colonial labor forces in this cultivation aimed at serving, in particular, the needs of Western military development, situate the plant, its seeds, and the oil within a complex set of colonial entanglements. So the next images I'm going to show, I want to sort of juxtapose these with Passet's image of the castor bean field in Beijing. Can I have the next image? Cool. These are a selection of images found on the Magnum Photography website, which were taken by Raymond Depardon in 1990 of the Paris-Dakar Rally. And so for me, the rally represents in various ways another visual iconography of the plantation scene, despite no plants or plantations being visible, but instead the barren moonscape landscapes captured and framed by Depardon. Going back further, in 1977, the grumpy techno-pessimist Paul Virilio published his first extended essay, Speed and Politics, in which he set out his concept of democracy, which he saw as defining the human condition, so this like the need for speed, I guess. This was a starting point for several decades of commentary on accelerationist society and the alienation produced by the ever faster, ever nearer, ever present. In Speed and Politics, Virilio evokes the desert as a metaphor for the loss of space and place, which takes place with, or which occurs with arrival of high-speed vehicles, including notably the racing car and the military assault vehicle. So the all-terrain should, he argues, really be called the sans-terrain, so the without terrain. So this association of the desert with emptiness or absence of place is obviously not unique to Virilio, but a key element of post-Enlightenment European thought, and moreover, ongoing colonial and neo-colonial fantasies around desert spaces. Alongside the forest and jungle, the desert constitutes the frontier par excellence, the space in which anything can happen. So what I think is interesting is just a year after, or a little more than a year after Speed and Politics is published by Virilio, Thierry Sabine launches the Paris-Dakar Rally. So previous year, Sabine had got lost in the Libyan desert while competing in the Abidjan-Nice Rally. And in using the word rally, obviously there's a double meaning to rally. So there's a kind of political rally, which we often associate with Nuremberg. But in French, the word raid also has a double meaning, which can mean attack or raid, as we understand it in English, but also kind of long distance trek or hike. And I think there's this very much this idea of kind of plunder, kind of steaming through somewhere and destroying everything in your path that we associate with an air raid, for example, that seems to be present in a kind of more critical understanding of raid in the context of Paris-Dakar. So Thierry Sabine is a figure who's surrounded by a lot of kind of mythology, particularly due to his tragic death during one of the rallies. He was guiding people in a helicopter and they got into difficulties and there was a helicopter crash which killed him and at least one other person on board. So he's become kind of almost, there's a kind of hagiography around Sabine as a result of this. So there's a lot of mythology around the origins of the Paris-Dakar Rally. So he's there in the Libyan desert. He has this sort of, he's about, he's not eaten for days. And this kind of catastrophe leads this epiphany that wouldn't this be a fantastic place for another rally? So the following year, that's what happens. So the 11,000 kilometer cross-border rally, the route varies from year to year, but it bore very, very little resemblance to, what we think about sort of as typical car racing. So places like Monaco, Le Mans. At the same time, what people liked about it was that it attracted the very same racing car drivers who thrived on those circuits alongside complete amateurs. I think perhaps one of the most amusing examples of Paris-Dakar amateur was Mark Thatcher, who got lost and kind of there was a sort of national crisis in the UK because it was when his mother was Prime Minister. And then it was kind of a little bit humiliating for him after. The rally's name, Paris Dakar, ended up being something of an arbitrary designation. So both cities kind of became placeholders rather than the fixed arrival departure sites. So the race only started in Paris about 17 out of 35 rallies held to date. Following the murder of French tourists in Mauritania in 2007, the race got cancelled and then moved away from its original location completely to South America, where the reference to Paris was dropped completely, and the rally has henceforth been known as the Dakar. So what becomes apparent in this so-called branding of the event is a total disconnection from the Senegalese city of Dakar itself. So the identity of the city, the culture of the city, public interest in the city. There's a really great book by Catherine Kilcline on sport and global France, and there's an excellent chapter in here that really tells the story much better than I am. And in it, Kilcline refers to the rally as a kind of monstrous itinerant Club Med, because it's basically predicated on neo-colonial fantasies of Africa, which they later get transposed onto South America, treating both sites as kind of playgrounds or laboratories. I think it's perhaps appropriate that the Dakar returned to Saudi Arabia, so to turn to the Saharan region, following a brief time in South America. During its time in South America, it came under significant criticism for the damage caused to sites of archaeological importance within the region, with people questioning what were the actual benefits. So the benefits that were posited was this is going to be great for tourism, but actually when people are passing through at high speed, it's not really attracting anybody. It's just destroying stuff. The move back to the Saharan region was criticised for different reasons. The event was dubbed another example of sport washing. Indeed, the 2021 route came within a few hundred meters of the infamous women's Al Hayr prison, where women's rights activist Loujain Al Hatoul is being held. But there's also something fitting about this route, given the sport's hyper-masculine celebration of petrol as a seemingly endless resource with no consideration given to the geopolitics surrounding its extraction. So where does that leave the castor bean? So within the wider context of what has come to be defined as energy humanities over the past couple of decades, there's an emerging body of literature dedicated to oil, particularly petrol, and global addiction to the automobile. But what I find significant is that there's far less interest today in what we might loosely refer to as plant-based oils. So these not only, as I've demonstrated with the castor bean plant, they don't just predate industrialization by thousands of years, but also due to their potentiality as biofuels, are increasingly posited by scientists as an intrinsic part of a sustainable future. Also, one of the most consistent sponsors of the Paris Dakar rally since at least the early 1980s was Castrol, often in tandem with different car manufacturers. So anyone who grew up in the 1980s and perhaps 1990s will remember the kind of epic Castrol GTX adverts on TV. But while there was a kind of high kind of TV presence of Castrol, its main marketing strategy from very, very early on was sponsoring high-profile races and events. So this included numerous land speed record attempts, and as I understand it, they are also part of kind of they're also used by NASA. So there's this very much this idea of colonial conquest beyond even the Earth itself via very kind of smooth running engines. Would it be okay to have the 7th image, please? So this is kind of an image I thought was kind of quite indicative of the connection between castor beans, castor oil, and the Paris Dakar Rally and the kind of desert. So the title of James and Lucien Becker's book, Gourmet Racin, so rubber and castor oil. So in French, racin is not just the kind of toxic part of, but it's kind of just generically means castor beans. So in the Becker's book, along with rubber, castor oil becomes a metonym for the automobile industry, acting as a reminder, just like rubber does, of the forgotten plantation landscapes, which in this context get displaced by deserts and cityscapes where the car is kind of center stage. So it kind of sort of glosses over that complete kind of backstory. So castor bean cultivation across the French Empire never reached the same levels of production as it did in the British Empire. So in the British Empire, castor bean production was largely found in India, but other places as well. In the French Empire, there were various places like Indochina, but also various parts of Africa. So the French Empire, you can find in the archives, in the colonial archives in Aix-en-Provence, you can find references to this cultivation in various reports from the First World War onwards, which emphasizes castor production as essential to French national defense due to its use as an engine lubricant, predominantly for aircraft. In an account of kind of forced or semi-forced labor within France's colonies, particularly as part of wartime effort, Babacar refers to the obligation to cultivate castor bean plants that was imposed by colonial administrators in Sudan, Senegal, Guinea, Togo, and Congo. And during the 1980s, Fall kind of interviewed various locals, various places of parts of Senegal. And many of them remembered this time when each village was obliged to cultivate a field of castor bean plants and referred to it as le champ du commandant, so the commander's field. But nobody really knew what it was for. So many of the people that Fall spoke to sort of remembered the same expression from 60 years before. Le raisin, c'est le mystère du commandant. So castor beans are the commander's mystery. So there's this cultivation of this plant that was actually native to the region. Often what was cultivated in the plantations tended to be imported from Brazil. So there was this cultivation with people thinking, well, we use that for this, but what do they want it? What do they want so much for? Without ever really knowing. So being obliged to give over space within their village and with their field to cultivate this, but completely decontextualized from everyday use. So moving beyond castor oil's role as accessory to fossil fuels, what does the future hold for the castor bean? So I haven't really mentioned, and I'm aware of time, I haven't really mentioned its extreme toxicity. It's apparently 6,000 times more poisonous than cyanide and 12,000 times more poisonous than rattlesnake venom. Its potential as biological weapon was explored by the US in the 1940s. And it's also perhaps best known for being at the heart of various poisoning scandals, including the use of a poisoned umbrella tip on KGB agent Georgy Markov in 1978. And also appeared in the news, which Claire told me about just yesterday, when a UK GP, Thomas Kwan, was arrested, accused of poisoning his mother's partner using ricin, which he'd been extracting, which is illegal to do because it's so toxic. So despite all this toxicity and kind of the sinister element of the castor bean, they're also considered a source of what we might term vegetal hope. The plants are being, at the moment, extensively cultivated in parts of Gujarat in India and considered to offer potential as biofuel, which is proposed as allowing divestment from fossil fuels. I'm really interested in a particular application which sees castor beans join forces with rubber once more in the form of sports shoes, trainers, which are produced by the Swiss firm On, that they claim are fully recyclable. You can't buy a pair, you have to subscribe. So this is part of a kind of strange thing where you subscribe and every time they wear out, you get a new pair. So very much this idea of the circular economy, and they're presented in the company's marketing as a running revolution. So I think that's kind of interesting, the way that this is still very much about the idea of speed, novelty, ever faster, ever smoother, but just kind of more integrated into the kind of into the human, if you like. Of course, the vegetable hope that lies with the castor bean and other plants being co-opted into a biofuel-led economy doesn't appear to offer a way out of existing patterns of consumption or the ever-proliferating plantation. And I think at this point, and I realise we're very short on time, so I will finish there and get Claire back, and perhaps we can see if there are any questions that have come up. Okay, so we might not have any questions. Probably bombarded everyone with so much information about these two very different species, and their complex histories across sort of empires and time. So I guess something I was going to ask you, Claire, was I guess about the ideas of collecting and the ideas of collecting for. So I think one of the previous sessions, Rebecca talked about the idea of plants as or trees as, and plants as living archives. And I'm not 100% sure that I would consider them archive, because an archive, there's a kind of different kind of intentionality and ideology in an archive. But I'm thinking about this idea of the seed archive and the collecting of the archive for the future, and what we think about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that this is maybe some of the, I mean, Gingko, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't have, well, it is a huge industry, actually. That isn't the way that I've interacted with it in my project, and that's not a side of its existence that I'm as familiar with. But it is grown in plantations. It's forested. It's a really popular food. So I think, yeah, there is a sort of sense in which I think we when we don't know about how sort of horticulture and agriculture actually gets done, if those are things that we have no involvement with, we sort of trust that people somewhere sort of over there, or like behind the scenes, are kind of preserving all of this biological diversity, right? And sort of someone somewhere is going to be doing that, right? And I guess that's the thing that I found really interesting about the national collections, is that someone somewhere is doing that, but it's quite in this country, at least, that's a sort of relatively sort of small scale endeavor if you think of like the industrial proportions, and all of the plants together in one location. Britain is not a set of islands that's kind of especially vulnerable to natural disaster, but if you get all your plant data, living data together in one place, then it is sort of vulnerable to loss potentially. So there are these interesting functions of like collecting and gathering that are much more practical and sort of applied immediately to industry and to commercial kind of continuation of plant species, I suppose, that are they're not available for the public to view. But I think perhaps it's just it's a little bit niche to the world of horticulture. That I thought it was quite interesting to maybe let a few more people know about. You were talking about the question of seed banks as well, and I think that's something that is a really interesting way of kind of, there is definitely an archiving that's going on there, right? There is that same practice of
projected to a particular imagined future. Now, I was at an interesting talk around around oceans and the other day, and someone was talking about marine biobanks and how they're predicated on quite a different ideology to seed banks, which are very much about what if we need to replant things, what if we lose everything, what if, and very much a kind of, and is it Svalbard that is known as the Doomsday Vault, which really is quite nihilistic. So it suggests let's just keep going as we are, but let's hoard these things. And of course, one of the issues, which I think applies to both seed banks and perhaps marine, but is where are these located? And they often tend to be located in the global north, or there are higher proportions of these things in places in countries that are whose legacies of colonialism have contributed to anthropogenic climate change. So there's that kind of,
I suppose Norway is quite a significant oil producer. But that's presumably partly how they have the funds to create the seed bank, right? Because I gather it's paid for by the government of Norway. So it's kind of doing this global service on behalf of all the other countries of the world.
Of course, perhaps every country needs to have Yes.
Yeah, this is not really my area, but I did read something about it, and so countries' national seed banks are the entities that deposit their seeds. So it's not a kind of public facing thing. And I gather that I think was it only Syria and Afghanistan are the organizations of national seed banks that have had to make withdrawals from the Svalbard Vault. So it's really, yeah, it is this kind of shoring up against catastrophe, but it's also kind of continuing, I think, like at national levels, um, different, specific countries' kind of ability to do agricultural production. But I do think there is something interesting there about this sort of a sort of slightly nihilistic fantasy of like the end time of catastrophe. There's that idea that people like to cite quite a lot from Frederick Jameson, that it's easier for us to imagine
the end of the world,
the end of the world through climate change than it is to imagine the end of the capitalist mode of production, because we don't have the imaginative tools really to imagine, what a reorganization of all of our activity and our production might look like as we exit out of capitalism. But we've got loads and loads of imaginative resources for thinking about kind of climate catastrophe, environmental chaos. So I think there is that way in which it just becomes, it's like easy for us to reach for those kind of imaginaries of the future, right? These catastrophes. And in some sense, quite attractive. I think there's a kind of there's an attraction to that. A sort of
kind of Mad
sudden,
Max,
insurmountable crisis. Yeah. Because then I think it's like at that point, you wouldn't have to deploy your own agency in a sense. You wouldn't have to work out really what to do in a way, if that's all sort of taken out of your hands by the course of events that is completely beyond your control. But we're kind of in this time where those things have not unfolded yet, or they unfold in particular locales, but not at the world level where we can say, yes, official global catastrophe. There is a sort of imagined fantasy aspect going on there.
We have some little question from Charlie, which is actually a big question. So it's very nice. Where do we see our work go? Both our work going next? So I was going to ask you, Claire, do you have any more plans to sort of upscale your project or to look at a different tree? I don't know.
I don't have something specific in mind that I'm doing with this, but it was really interesting that you were mentioning Maria Sibylla Merian's work, because that I hadn't been aware that she did that she illustrated ricin as part of her project in Suriname, because I teach my art history students about her work. We look at the history of the Dutch Empire. So that's really interesting for me in terms of my teaching. But the thing that the project that I'm sort of working on next is about a kind of visual history of viewing the world as a whole. So I'm hoping to kind of encompass quite a broad, like, I was thinking of time again, this kind of broad historical view through the Middle Ages, right up to kind of NASA's digital renderings of the Earth that evolved kind of out of the photographing of the Earth from space. And so then they sort of evolved, the images are called the blue marble, and then they've sort of evolved them into these purely digital, almost kind of, again, fantasies of what the Earth might be like and what it might look like. They started issuing ones without clouds and all of these sorts of things, like the Earth as this kind of completely impossible entity. If it has no hydrological cycle, no life on Earth exists. And then this also feeds into kind of flat Earth conspiracy theorists. And some of them, I follow them on Instagram as well, and they point to these kind of digital fantasizings of the Earth as viewed from space as kind of evidence of NASA's perfidy and its involvement in kind of perpetuating fantasies of the globe Earth. And people who believe in the globe Earth for the flat earthers are called globers. So I think that's an interesting new project that I'm kind of starting to put together my thoughts about viewing the Earth from the Earth as a whole.
And of course, NASA is powered by Castrol GPX. So I think we kind of need to start to call time on this, we wanted to end with a final image because we were sort of, particularly as Claire's been talking about the difficulty of imagining different futures and how we've got quite a nihilistic fantasies of kind of apocalypse. And so the final image that we wanted to look at was from Chris Marker's La Jetée, where you have this beautiful scene with the tree and the sort of the lines of the tree, and they're talking about when things happen. And the man says to the woman, and it's his way of explaining that he comes from a time that she can't conceive of, and she doesn't know. He sort of points beyond the tree and says, "This is where I'm from," and then it's just, and then she gets it because it's a beautiful film and doesn't need any more explanation than that. So I think it's just sort of a way to I think it's just a really nice way to think again about this idea of the tree as witness, to that kind of exceeds, but also helps us maybe one way that we can understand more than human and beyond our kind of the kind of smallness of both humans and humanity is via the tree, and particularly the ginkgo. So to wrap up, I'd obviously like to give Claire a huge thank you for joining me this evening. Also like to thank Alex for doing the tech behind the scenes, as well as the rest of the Bonington team, Post-Colonial Studies Research Group, and everyone else who's taken part in the series. Please check out Bonington Gallery's events page for details of other events happening. This will be up on their YouTube site as well. Thanks also to everyone at home for tuning in, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of your evening, your afternoon, or your morning, and look forward to seeing you at an event soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.